So let's make a start. I'm really delighted to welcome Peg Fraser. Peg was a curator at Museums Victoria and was actively involved in the Black Saturday Bushfire Oral History Project. Produced a wonderful PhD that then became the prize-winning book, Black Saturday, Not the End of the Story, which won the Victorian Community History Oral History Award last year and just recently won the 2019 Oral History Association of Australia Book Award. And Peg is coming to us from the Adelaide Hills. So Peg, over to you, and thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Al. Thank you for that introduction. Good morning from a very soggy day in the Adelaide Hills. Although soggy is good these days. Thank you to the OHA for the award and for asking me to speak today. And congratulations to Scott and all the winners of the media prize as well. I'm very honored to receive this award. I think the prizes are a great initiative to recognize the work that all of us do and to promote the practice of oral history. And I'm looking forward to seeing some really exciting projects being recognized in the years to come as well. Now, I know Al said in the information that he sent around that lots of people are up to speed with the technology, but I'm not one of them. So I was really pleased when he said, we're going to keep it simple and just do talking and listening, because I can do that. So here we go. When the devil came over the mountain, that is a quote I've been wanting to use for a long time. It comes from Thomson in an interview from 2013 that we did for the Victorian Bushfires collection at Museum Victoria. Darren lived in Strathewen, which is a tiny place on the outskirts northeast of Melbourne, and it was badly hit in the bushfires of 2009. And his words describe the moment when the Kilmore East fire burst around the flanks and over the top of Mount Sugarloaf to the west of Strathewen. And Darren's house was just below the shoulder of the mountain, and he and Ian McKinnon were trying to defend Ian's house next door. And despite all their preparations and efforts, the house burned, and Darren's house, and 80% of the houses in Strathewen. And the men took refuge behind a small water tank. They made a little soak with the remaining water and some wet towels. It's astonishing that they survived, and 27 people in the community did not. Darren's description is really, really powerful. It's a strong image from a dramatic narrative, and it has many of the elements that we heard repeated in interviews and in books and media productions about Black Saturday. You know, there's the lack of warning, that force of that initial impact, the fear and adrenaline, the portrayal of the fire as an animate being that was out to get them, you know, the classic battle between good and evil. But I haven't used that quote until now because it's actually the opposite of what much of my work has been about. I was interested in exploring less familiar narratives, especially those in which the effects of the bushfires impacted people's lives for years afterwards, long after the public drama had faded. But I'm using that phrase today because as oral historians, you are all familiar with the tension between different narratives and how tricky it can be to navigate that tension. And you all know the thrill of finally being able to use a really good line. So Al asked me to talk about what I've learned about oral history and the environment. And that gives me a lot of scope because when I started, I knew virtually nothing about either oral history or the environment. My master's thesis was on 19th century schoolgirl embroidery, and my background was in developing museum exhibitions with migrant communities. So when I got involved with the bushfires collection as part of the collecting project in 2010, my focus was originally on the material culture. But I quickly realized that without the personal stories behind them, many of these objects were destined to be simply curiosities or sacred relics. We needed oral history interviews to dig more deeply into personal stories, to add richness and complexity to the collection. And the interviews expanded until they and not the objects became my major historical sources. And increasingly, I saw that those stories included a profound and sometimes problematic relationship with the environment. A little bit about Strathewen, which is the place where I focused my research. It's a tiny place. In 2008, it had 200 people. For somewhere that's less than an hour's drive from Melbourne suburbs, it's remarkably isolated. It's hard to get to. There are no shops beyond the school. Sorry, there are no jobs beyond the school and the fruit packing shed, and nobody wants to work there. There are no shops, and not even a pub. It's the kind of place that takes a certain amount of conscious effort and commitment to live in. And the environment was the primary motivation people gave for living in Strathewen. But they didn't call it the environment, they called it the bush. Now, that's a complex and emotive word in Australia, and I think it's no coincidence that it was so widely used. On the surface, it describes Strathewen's physical surroundings. It's nestled in between two spurs of the Kinglake Ranges, surrounded by native forest, watercourses, and wildlife. But the bush is a cultural construct as much as a physical one. And in the oral history interviews, I soon found that the physical and the cultural were inextricably linked. When people talked about living in the bush, as many of them did, they weren't just talking about their physical environment. They were describing a relationship between themselves and those surroundings, one that was deeply entwined with their personal identity. Now, that relationship was based on many different factors, and so in the course of the interview, I began to see many different ideas of the environment emerging. It's a powerful symbol, and its significance varied from person to person. Escape from the evils of city living, association with the rural ideals of independence and pragmatism, clean air and space for children to play, identification with aesthetic or artistic values, or with feeling connected to the natural world, a sense of being part of the real Australia. Social relationships were deeply embedded in the landscape, especially for the descendants of early European settlers and those who had grown up in Strathewen. In these stories, the idea of the bush was as important as its physical reality. Now, given the many rules that individuals projected onto the environment, it's hardly surprising that on a community level, the environment was a contested space. Strathewen lies in Nillumbik Shire, which had a reputation for pursuing a strong, some would say aggressive, green agenda. The community is hard up against the border of the Kinglake Ranges National Park, where environmental decisions are made by the state that impact on Strathewen residents. Some of the bitterest public disputes, both before and after Black Saturday, were concerned with managing the environment. One of the narrators I worked with was a passionate advocate for protecting local ecosystems, and this often put her in conflict with other residents who placed more importance on access to the city or public safety or defending their homes against bushfire. In the aftermath of Black Saturday, when many people had lost their lives trying to flee along heavily overgrown roadways, or trying to defend houses surrounded by gum trees they were legally forbidden to clear, these divisions became more pronounced, and community meetings often dissolved into shouting matches about which was more important, the environment or human life. But at the same time, the environment was associated with the recovery of the survivors. The regeneration of the bush after Black Saturday was celebrated as a symbol of human resilience, as well as environmental resilience. People took thousands of photos, documenting the regrowth of tree ferns and the emergence of epicormic growth on eucalypts. These were included in art exhibitions, calendars, fundraising efforts, and websites, including the museum's own. A global art project resulted in the blacksmith's tree, a 5-meter tall steel sculpture of a eucalypt that found its permanent home in Strathewen. It stands just beside the Strathewen Memorial, whose text explicitly links community recovery to environmental recovery. The memorial borrows lines from a poem by Ian McKinnon, Darren Thomson's neighbor, that first appeared on the Poetry Tree, a spontaneous memorial in the heart of Stratheward. Ian wrote, "The spirit of the sugar loaf protected us as it burned. This is the gift which we received and continue to receive, as the spirit and the gifted ones slowly healed together." Now, this was not everyone's story. Many people left the bushfire zone too tired or traumatized or afraid to rebuild. May Proudly, one of the group of researchers who worked with the Bushfire Cooperative Research Centre, examined the role of place attachment in resilience and decisions to rebuild after Black Saturday. And her findings suggested that a strong identification with a bushfire-affected place can make people more resilient and yet more vulnerable, as it intensifies both the joy of survival and the pain of loss. And Ian himself was a divisive character who caused great heartache to some of the other residents. There are people in Stratheward who'd be really upset with me quoting his poem. These are complicated narratives, as complicated as people themselves. And I think part of oral history's essential task is to complicate and disrupt dominant narratives, to bring the fine grain of the intensely personal experience into the big story and to question public acceptance of simple questions and simple answers. If I had to distill what I have learned about oral history and the environment, it would be that the environment was a mirror in which many people saw reflected their hopes, their dreams, their ambitions, and their fears. And it's by listening through oral history to the stories that communicate those hopes and ambitions that we can begin to understand the complexity of people's relationship with the environment. I hope that my book helped to illuminate some of the difficult questions around bushfire. But lately I've been asking myself a question. Where do we go from here? It was Tom Griffiths who said that Black Saturday inspired a new kind of bushfire literature, and I'd like to think that my book was part of that new movement. And a year ago, I would have said that the work in it was contemporary and still relevant. Now, however, it feels old. I'm sure that many of you have noticed that this account of oral history and the environment is missing something. It's actually missing quite a few things, but what I'd like to focus on today is the discussion of climate change. Now, part of the reason it's missing is because at the time that I was conducting interviews, the narrators were caught up in intense efforts to reestablish their physical and social and financial and emotional well-being. And you can understand how those difficult personal challenges occupied most of their thoughts and most of our conversations. And it was partly because when I did ask narrators for their thoughts on climate change, there was at that time sufficient uncertainty in the public discourse for people to be able to deny it, or to defer the question, or to deem the issue either too big to deal with or irrelevant to their particular situation. I didn't challenge them on this question, and that troubles me now. The Black Summer has changed things. Up until this past fire season, bushfires played by the rules. They were larger or smaller, more or less extreme, more or less fatal, but they occupied a necessary and reasonably predictable niche in the Australian ecosystem. Black Saturday, the most fatal fire in our history, pushed the envelope of what a catastrophic fire could do to people and the environment, but it didn't break the envelope. The Black Summer did. For a start, it began 6 months before peak fire season, and fires burned for 240 days. One crisis rolled into another without a break, and I think we can all remember the looks of exhaustion on the faces of the emergency services personnel. Arrangements for sharing emergency equipment and crews fell apart because everybody needed them at the same time. Fires pushed into areas that had never before burned, that had not evolved to burn, as the mountain ash forests have, and they may never recover from that fire. Black Summer displaced thousands of people, and many of them were not people like the Strathuan residents who had chosen to live in a bushfire region. They were ordinary people on holiday in areas that were not considered high-risk zones. The impact from bushfire smoke affected 80% of all Australians, caused more than 400 deaths, thousands of hospital admissions, and is expected to lead to higher mortality rates. And this is in addition to the 33 deaths directly caused by the fire and the loss of more than 6,000 buildings. 35 million hectares were burned, and it is estimated that over 1 billion native animals died. And unlike in 2009, there can be no debate, no sensible debate about whether or not climate change was a decisive factor. And bushfire is only one risk. Climate modeling predicts that droughts will continue to get longer and more severe. Cyclones and floods will become more destructive. Sea levels will rise. More species will be pushed to extinction. And zoonotic diseases like COVID-19 are expected to increase due to environmental degradation. The devil has come over the mountain, not just for Darren, but for all of us. So I've been asking myself, in light of the greatest challenge to our environment and our civilization, what can I, as an oral historian, do? And I don't have an answer for that. Now, this is my moment of personal angst, but I'm sharing it with you because I suspect that I'm not alone. This kind of work takes a toll on people. Disaster history and environmental history is increasingly concerned with disasters, can be confronting enough. But oral historians are involved with intimate personal memories that include terror, grief, anger, and sometimes despair. We know that this can be very distressing for our narrators and also for ourselves. And to see it all happening again is demoralizing. After my book came out, I said I was done with bushfire. I was tired of working with traumatic memory and with asking people to relive the worst day of their lives, and with the worry that the result, my book, would not be worth the emotional cost to the narrators. I was living overseas at the time, and that made it easier to put some distance between me and the bushfire zone. I even contemplated going back to embroidery. But I returned to Australia and to the Black Summer, and I realized that it didn't matter where I lived. I couldn't walk away from it. Now, keynote addresses are supposed to be about new ideas and encouragement and maybe even inspiration. But today, that's what I'm looking for from you. Today's symposium is a very hopeful sign, and so is the Forum on Urgent Histories that the AHA is organizing, and the book on disaster histories that I hope Scott is going to tell us about. I think that over the course of today, we will hear about oral history projects that are moving the discussion on the changing environment. And I hope that our conversations together will inspire some new initiatives. We are good at building big pictures out of small clues, at asking questions that might be overlooked, at bringing big historical events down to intimate and personal and relatable levels, at bringing voices to public attention that might otherwise be overwhelmed. I think those skills will become increasingly useful as we move into an uncertain and demanding future. In the same way that Black Saturday demanded a new kind of history making, I think that the events of the past year will also need a new kind of history making. And I'm not sure what that will look like, but I hope that I and all of us will be part of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Peg, so much. You've always had that wonderful museum curator's ability to turn complex prose into pithy sentences or phrases, like the big picture out of small clues, or oral history's task is to complicate, or the environment as a mirror. So there's a lot of lots for us to talk about. So we've got 15 minutes for questions and discussion with Peg. Hopefully in your small groups you've thought of some questions you'd like to ask. When you do, we're not going to get you speaking them because it's a bit tricky with this number. So just type your question into the chat, and Naomi Frost is going to be moderating those questions and fielding them and posing them to Peg. So I'm going to hand it over to Naomi now that we've got one question already. So over to you, Naomi.
Excellent, thanks Al. So Peg, we did get one question through the breakout sessions for you. So in the years after your project, you said that you felt demoralized at times. How did you personally improve or keep safe your emotions and impacts to yourself?
Well, we were very fortunate in the museum that they were aware of the impact that the three curators who were working on the bushfires collection might be experiencing. So we had access to a counselor if we needed it. But, and my boss, Lisa Dale Hallett, who started the collection, kept coming up to me and saying, "You haven't been to see the counselor. I think you should talk to the counselor." And one day I finally just said, "Lisa, I don't need a counselor. I've got a garden." And that really was where I sort of was able to reset myself and, you know, maintain my equilibrium. I think what I meant when I said it's demoralizing was that it's just actually been in the last year to interview people and to hear stories of terrible hardship and fear and everything else, and then to turn on the news in 2019-20 and to hear different people using almost exactly the same words. It is discouraging. It was sort of, well, have we learned nothing? So that's where it comes from.
Excellent, thank you. And another group asked, how might we ask questions about climate change without creating an inflammatory conversation? Or do we need to accept that it might be difficult?
Look, I've been sort of tuning into the hearings of the Bushfire Royal Commission right now, and there was a wonderful moment where the senator, the One Nation senator who's sitting on the commission, asked Mullins, the former head of New South Wales Fire Services, if he could point to evidence to provide a link between climate change and the bushfires of the past year. And the response was wonderful, and I'm paraphrasing slightly, but he said, "I'm old, I don't have time to deal with people who deny climate, with climate denialists who refuse to consider the settled science." So I think that it's actually shifted, and I feel it in the public narrative, that there is a shift, and that far more people are now talking about climate change, not as a possibility, but that it is a major factor. And I think that shift in the public narrative will make it a lot easier to have this kind of discussion, because it isn't just a matter of personal opinion anymore. I think that really has moved.
Excellent, thank you. Thanks for that question as well. We have another one here. Does the idea of environment as a major risk positioning the environment as passive and thus as part of the problem, that the agency of the environment is not recognized. Sorry, not sure if I phrased that well. Does the idea of the environment as a mirror risk positioning the environment as a passive and thus part of the problem, that the agency of the environment is not recognized?
Look, I think that's a really interesting question. And I would say that, and I am extrapolating from the interviews and from the narrators, but I would say that many of them did view the environment as something passive. That, to put it another way, I think they saw the environment in terms of themselves and their own preoccupations, rather than being an independent entity and an independent force. So I would agree with that.
Excellent. Thank you. And another good question here, how do you strike a balance between recovery and forgetting?
Oh, gosh. In terms of people who have experienced the bushfire?
I'm not sure where
Yeah.
that question was coming from.
Well, look, I'll answer it as if, how do people who have survivors find that balance? And it is, it's a totally individual thing. So I worked with people, when the book came out, which was nearly 10 years after Black Saturday, we had a book launch with everybody, and everybody who had contributed was invited, and we had about 80 people there. And so I was able to catch up and with a lot of people that I hadn't seen for a while, and some of them they recovered by saying that part of my life is over. I'm not talking about it. Some of them have not even read the book. Other people found recovery through continuing to reflect on it and what it meant for their lives. Other people were still traumatized after 10 years. And recovery was still a very fragile concept for them. So it's there are as many paths to recovery as there are people who experienced it.
Thank you. And Alicia has asked, what do you think about the impact of the passage of time? If you interviewed your Strathroom community now, how would they see their experience differently? And how would you broach the conversation around climate change? Yeah.
Look, I think that's one of the really fascinating things for me about doing oral history, is seeing how stories change and perspectives change, influenced by what has happened since the event that people are recalling and the time at which they are telling you their story. And it's a really, really, well, I think I've said, it can be really frustrating, because when you're doing sequential interviews, the stories changed. I interviewed somebody in 2010 and they told me something, and in 2013 it was completely different. But I think that's actually one of the strengths of oral history, is to look at how people make sense of what happened to them and how that has been reflected in the oral histories. In terms of climate change, I think that I could go back now and talk to those people, and as I said, the public narrative, the public environment has shifted, and so that I think that climate change would not be dismissed as it was in so many of the original interviews, partly because 10 years after an event, people have got more distance and more perspective, and perhaps not less emotion, but are able to take a more balanced view of what happened to them, and are able to start considering things like the role of climate change, which many of them just simply, they just couldn't get their head around it at that point.
Excellent, thank you. And I know you've actually just addressed this to a degree, but Al has also asked, people are planning oral histories of our recent Black Summer. What are the pros and cons of interviewing soon after such an event?
You know, I was just thinking about this the other day because I was looking back at some of the discussion after, in the United States, after Hurricane Katrina and after the attacks on September 11th. And there was actually a kind of, there was a proposal that was being tossed around to have what they called a flying squad of oral historians who would be trained in specific techniques for disaster oral history, who could then fly into a part of the country to interview, to conduct oral histories. And in some ways it made a lot of sense because those people would have specific skills but I thought it was, what bothered me about it was that and I won't say names because I'm a little, I can't be absolutely sure, but the idea was that we needed to get to people to tell their stories before they became history, before they became polluted by being subsumed into dominant narratives and public narratives. And I think that is entirely, it's a reasonable concern. But I also think that it doesn't, there are, I'm sorry, I'm lost for words here. At the same time, if you look at the psychology, you know, psychologists used to say we have to get on the ground and help people who are in disaster situations as quickly as possible and get them to tell their story, because that's how they will recover, that's how they will heal. And if they don't do that, they're going to be in big trouble. And they've actually moved on from that. So Rob Gordon, who did a great deal of work as a consulting psychologist with survivors from Black Saturday, said that he's actually reconsidered that, and he's concerned that psychologists coming in and encouraging people to relive what happened to them is actually causing psychological damage. So I think that there are a lot of pitfalls in going in quickly after a disaster. It can be, I think it probably can be done, but I would say that you'd have to insist on longitudinal interview studies so that you could go back to those people a year later, 2 years later, 3 years later, and see what has changed for them.
Excellent, thank you. And I think that this is the last question that we have time for today, but it's actually very relevant to what you've just said now. Gerard Callanan has said, I'm working on a Black Saturday oral history project, and I'm now struck by how unemotive the interviews I've done thus far. Is there a shelf life for capturing oral histories?
Depends on what you want out of your oral history, isn't it? Doesn't it? It certainly oral, you know, if you do an oral history in the early days, you do capture the emotion and the drama. And the more distance you have, the more opportunity there is for people to reflect, to change, or to embed their stories. I was struck, a couple of my narrators insisted on very rigid accounts of what had happened to them. And even years later, they were, you know, I interviewed somebody who survived the Ash Wednesday bushfires in 1983. And 28 years later, she could still tell me where the blankets were kept that they wrapped around themselves when they ran out of the house, and what she was wearing and so on. And I did realize that that had become fossilized, that this was the story she told, and that was all there was to it. And it was, it could not be challenged. It could not be, you know, added to in any way. And it really, I think, was one of the most fascinating things of my research, was to examine narratives like that and think about how the narrative itself was performing a service for that person, and to understand that, you know, the oral history is it's a two-way street, and that even though I was interested in what we could learn from oral histories, the oral history process itself was performing a service for the survivors. And it was up to them. It was up to them what that service was going to be.
Thank you, Peg. And that's probably a good place just to pause at this point. This next session, we've got a series of, well, we've got the first part of the next session, we've got two presenters, Lorina Barker and Scott McKinnon, and then we'll have a breakout. And then we've got a final, Katie Holmes interviewing Deb Anderson and Karen Twigg, and another breakout, and then Q&A to the whole of the four of them, well, the whole six panel together. So let me first off introduce Lorina Barker. I first met Lorina, I think it was 2007 at the Oral History Conference in Queensland. And then we drove back down to Armidale with Janice Wilton. And I knew then that Lorina was going to be an extraordinary oral historian, and that's proved to be the case. So Lorina is a Wankamara Wurruwari from Burke in northwest New South Wales. She's University of Armidale, and she's the lead chief investigator of the Songlines of Country, Oral History and Multimedia Project. So pleased you could join us from Armidale, Lorina. Over to you.
Thanks, Al, and thanks for inviting me to speak this morning. I think it's, you know, the COVID-19 has presented us with a lot of opportunities to be able to adapt the way in which we do our, we meet online. And I guess for us all it also may be the way of the world, and for future oral history projects as well. So before I begin, I just, again, as Al says, my name's Lorina Barker. I'm a Turragurra. I'm the Black Cormorant. That's my meat, my totem. I'm a descendant of the Wankamara and Wurruwari peoples of northwest New South Wales. I'm a descendant of the Adnyamathanha people from the Flinders Ranges in South Australia, the Coomera and Kunya people of southwest Queensland, and the Gurnu Barkindji people of northwest New South Wales. I'm an oral historian, and I teach Australian history, oral history, and local and community history here at UNE in Armidale. So my cultural introduction identifies who I am, where I come from, and who I belong to, and my family affiliations. Us blackfellas always want to know first your tribal or clan or family group. It's a way of determining your kinship relationships and how somebody is to engage and relate to you. So what's your name, where you're from, and who are your mob? So thanks, Al, for inviting me to have a yarn with you all today, and to share some of my own experiences of working on various community projects, and as well as give you some insight into the songlines of country and the deep history and knowledge of Indigenous oral history. So I do have a little PowerPoint slide. Hal would have seen this PowerPoint slide, and I use it as a preface to my my presentations now. And so it's a little bit overcast here in Armidale, and I'm a bit worried that I might drop out. So if it does, I'll share my screen, and then if I have some problems, I'll just unshare it and continue on with the presentation. So I'll just do that now. So can you all see that?
All good, Lorina. Great,
Yeah.
thanks.
Okay, great. So to set the scene of my talk, my yarn today, I'm a Wankamara Murrawari scholar, and it is from this positioning that I speak and share my stories, memories and experiences about what I have and do learn about oral history from yarning on country with Aboriginal knowledge holders and elders and family and community members. And also what country and the stories country tell us and what we can learn from country. As we previously heard from Peg, thank you. So as a direct result of colonisation, we, the Aboriginal people of Australia, were shot and killed in massacres. We were rounded up on trucks like livestock and moved from our traditional lands to places of control, to the missions and reserves on the fringes of white Australian society. We were forced to learn English, to read and write, and in the process we lost a lot of our languages and our ways of speaking. As the fences went up, our traditional lands, waterways and sacred sites were locked up and resumed as part of big cattle and sheep stations and agricultural enterprises. They became no-go zones for our peoples, and in the process we lost a great deal of our ways of doing business on country, for country and for life. I now ask you to consider the following places, their cultural spiritual significance, the oral histories, stories, meanings and meanings of these places. So we've got the pyramids of Giza, this image courtesy of the Cordon Press, National Geographic, dated to about 2,550 years ago. Stonehenge, dated 5,000 years ago, and the baby of them all is the Pyramid of the Sun, and other pyramids of around in South America is about 5,000 years ago. So you'd all be familiar with them. You may not be so familiar with this place. And it's called Byam's Nunu. It's dated to about 60,000 years old. The Nyimba people who built the Nunu are joined by other Aboriginal groups like the Murrawari, the Wailawan, the Gamilaroi, the Yaalioi, the Gurnu Barkinji, and they gather here for spiritual, social and economic businesses. I'm a descendant of two of these groups, the Murrawari and the Gurnu Barkinji, with family and community affiliations with other groups who are the oldest living continuous cultures in the world. Our oral histories can be dated back to 7,000 years ago and counting. These, of course, are the researchers' dates. So we can date these, researchers have dated these, our oral histories back to the last glacial ice age. So the deep knowledge and history of Indigenous oral history is a millennia-long tradition that is intrinsically woven into Indigenous people's way of life, our history and culture. As Aboriginal people, we live it every day. It's a part of who we are, where we come from, and who we are related to. It also determines our interconnected relationships and responsibilities to our lands, rivers, seas, skies, and to all living and inanimate things in both the natural and spiritual worlds. Indigenous oral history is an inherent and innate way of recounting the past and sharing cultural knowledge and history in the present, so that it is passed on to future generations. So oral history, as a good friend Elfi Shiosaki explains, is living stories. Indigenous oral histories have been, for the most part, dismissed or merely as merely traditions made up of myths and legends. This thinking continues to be challenged by Indigenous scholars like Nipia Mayoka, Fabry Blacklock, and Elfie Shiosaki, and of course myself, in an effort to incorporate Indigenous perspectives, which enriches the discipline of oral history. So these are the language groups of Australia. You might be familiar with those. And the way in which Aboriginal people are now using new technology, new media to share our history, culture and stories, and our deep connections to country, and the way in which groups care for country throughout this continent. So these are some of the documentaries that, if you're interested, websites that you can actually visit. So as we're finding, Western science is only just starting to catch up with Indigenous knowledge and history, and so these are some of the research that has actually gone on and is actually been currently undertaken by various universities and institutions throughout the country. And so they tell us exactly what our songlands have always told us, that we have been in our territories and in our countries for over 50,000 years, and it also these research projects are also telling us that what we've already know. And our practice, that we're also interconnected and interrelated to our neighbours. And again, as I showed you earlier, through Biami's Nunu, we have been coming together as groups of people for trade, ceremony, and for country at places like Biami's Nunu for centuries. So to tell you a little bit about the songlines, and these are, as I think about some of the opportunities and challenges of oral history, and the stories that are coming from country, and the people that I work with and have been working for many years now. So Songlines of Country is an ARC funded project, and a lot of my thinkings and musings about working with community members on country has also come from a multimedia project called Looking Through Windows that I ran in 2017, 2018. So they're both multimedia projects, oral history and multimedia projects, and it's the opportunity that multimedia bringing multimedia and old art forms and new technologies, and where they merge and cross over and intersect, to show our languages, cultures and histories are being presented, reclaimed and passed on to the next generations through film, short stories, poetry, music, theatre performance and weaving. Multimedia provides culturally and sensitive ways of representing Aboriginal people's images, voices, stories, especially those family and community members who have joined our ancestors. So I've also been thinking about the on-country methodology, which I've developed. Sorry, I'm having trouble with my internet connection with my iPad, which which has all my notes on. So the on-country cultural spaces, as part of the projects that I work on, and as well as for the Songlines of Country, are cultural spaces. They're spaces where Aboriginal elders and community members gather together to share stories, to connect to family and to country. These gatherings provide a cultural space for elders and community members to come together, to have a yarn and a cuppa, and to share their stories, to rediscover, reclaim and reconnect to their history, culture and country. So in a few weeks' time, I'll also be trialling the online and the way in which to interview and work with communities online through Zoom, so to do some remote oral history recordings. And I just amended my ethics approval, which came through a couple of weeks ago, to give me permission to do some of those oral history recordings online. So it's an opportunity to, in our current climate with COVID-19, is to record our elders, because time is of the essence. There is an urgent need to document the Aboriginal experience and to demonstrate the tenacity and strength of our elders, to record and preserve our languages and histories and connect us to our peoples, our identities, our cultures and our countries. It is also critical that we as researchers and artists use our skills and knowledge to support Aboriginal elders, to adapt, share, to be able to adapt and share their cultural knowledge online and in online platforms, and to use new technologies to minimise the social isolation caused by COVID-19, as we cannot underestimate the impact it will have on our knowledge holders and our elders.
Lorina, just 2 more minutes, if that's okay.
Yep. So some of the things I've been musing about is how do we do this, and how do we, going through the Western education system, I too have had to decolonise myself, so how to decolonise oneself when working with Indigenous peoples. And the act of decolonisation is to be present, to be grounded in country, to position yourself, to listen to country, to the people and to the stories that you have been gifted. Know the country and the people. It is your responsibility to inform yourself and also learn how to read country. The reciprocity, sometimes institutions can get in the way of reciprocity. So how do we credit knowledge holders and creators of our bodies of work, our research projects? And reciprocity is an ongoing process. Some of the challenges, of course, is also served up with multimedia. So if you're working with film, the film royalties for the oral history and community, MOUs, memorandums of understandings, the process is lengthy, it's a contract, and these are negotiated relationships. There's also the ethics that need to be considered, to be respectful and to always do no harm, and to leave no footprint. Cultural protocols, the principles of trust, respect, reciprocity, relationality are deeply embedded in the cultural protocols in Australia and the way in which we do business on country. The intellectual property rights, how do we negotiate intellectual property rights in relation to Aboriginal-led and Aboriginal-focused projects, including a clause such as this: the university agrees that the intellectual property will remain the property of the researcher and the Aboriginal communities she or he represents. The researcher findings will be the property of the researcher and the descendant families and communities. So we can also include these in the MOUs and also in our ethics applications. So other things I've been musing is how do we also prepare people to be able to work with us in Aboriginal-led research projects, and what it is that we need to do. So I'm also working on, and we'll be able to present at a later date, a comic strip methodology, which I call We Don't Need a Roadmap. So it's a way of for Aboriginal researchers to also vet those and prepare those people to be able to work with us to go out into our community. These are the images I took from country in Nipabanna. So this is the start of our journey for the songlines of country. So I'll flick through. You would not necessarily know these places, but this is the site of my great-grandparents' house where their umpy used to be at the Nipabanna mission. And so you can also see the Flinders Ranges and just down the back of their place is the creek that runs alongside it. If you read country, this is Eagle Mountain, and this is also where the Akaras, the water snakes, pass through. So on their journey around Adnyamathanha country, and where they journeyed from the Flinders Ranges to the Corner Country, and then over to Western New South Wales. And so when they start their journey here in Adnyamathanha country, there's two Akaras, the male and female. And then as they get closer to the Darling, they separate. And so the Murawari people refer to the male to the water snake as Mundagara. And when they're by themselves, they also take on male-female identities, so they can be referred to as he or she. And of course, they go on their separate journeys, and this is what the songlines of country is tracking. If you look closely, there's a story about the woman, and she lies there beside the Akara's mountain where they passage through, and a dingo tore into her leg, and that's where she lies and remains. So I'll leave it for you to sort of see if you can read country and see the lady in the landscape. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lorina. Thank you. There's so much for us to think about finding age-old stories and contemporary living stories, about combining old art forms and new technologies, about decolonising ourselves as we try and do these sorts of oral histories. Hold your questions for Lorina, because we're going to have one more presentation and then a breakout where you can talk about the two presentations and prepare questions to ask of Lorina. Lorina, if you could unshare your screen now, and I'll then introduce our next speaker, which is Scott McKinnon, who's in Wollongong. Scott's an oral historian and a geographer at the Australian Centre for Culture, Environment, Society and Space. His research explores collective experience of disasters, and he's a co-editor with Margaret Cook, who's also with us today. A book published this year by Palgrave Macmillan, Disasters in Australia and New Zealand, Historical Approaches to Understanding Catastrophe. Welcome, Scott, and over to you.
Great, thank you, Al. Excuse me, and thanks to Oral History Victoria for the invitation today. As Al says, I am in Wollongong, and I want to begin by acknowledging that I live and work on the unceded lands of the Dharawal people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And in the next 10 minutes or so, I'm going to try to tease out some ideas about the interweaving of memory, home and the environment, based on interviews with survivors of bushfires in Australia. So I want to particularly acknowledge that while the interviews I'm drawing on are with non-Indigenous people, the land on which their homes were built and on which all of our homes are built has its own continuing history of dispossession of Indigenous Australians, and which is to acknowledge that memories of traumatic loss are embedded in the Australian environment in ways that continue to impact First Nations people. So I've been asked to reflect on the question, what have you learnt about the environment by doing oral history? And I have to admit, and I share something with Peg here, in that before I started doing interviews with disaster survivors, I hadn't really thought about the environment very much at all, at least not in the terms that I'm using it here, meaning more or less the natural environment. I don't make claims to being an environmental historian, and my PhD, much of my early research career, was researching the history of inner city queer communities. In that work, I was, however, interested in how queer people might come to understand the spaces around us as home, how a particular street or a bar or a cinema might feel like home because you feel safe there, sometimes safer than when you are actually at home. And because the experiences you have in those spaces form memories on which identities are based, so that returning to these memory-filled spaces, or even just developing a picture of them in your mind can feel like a kind of homecoming. So then I got a new job, and one of my tasks in that job was to interview people in Brisbane, Christchurch, and the Blue Mountains about their experiences of floods, earthquakes, and bushfires, respectively. And those interviews encouraged me to think about the environment in new ways, or I should say ways that were new to me. Even after that particular job finished, I've continued to work on histories of disaster in the years since. Partly, I think, because as someone who's interested in spaces of memory, disaster histories force us to consider what happens when spatial or material forms of memory are suddenly gone. So the main idea I want to focus on here is the idea of home, or of what makes a space feel like home, or what makes us feel like we're at home in a particular space. And I think one of the key things I've begun to understand about the environment through oral history interviews is that affective and embodied connections to spaces in nature often blur the boundaries between the material structure of a house and the emotional meanings of being at home. So I'm drawing on today on interviews that I've just been doing very recently with residents of Kangaroo Valley here in New South Wales, 5 or 6 months after the fires of January 4th this year. And this is a multidisciplinary project. I'm kind of pretending to be a social scientist at the moment rather than historian. I'm working with researchers in disaster resilience, geographers and engineers who are actually interested in the material structures through which we can build disaster resilience. And I've completed 15 interviews, all with people who lived on large blocks of land out of town, surrounded by trees and either bordering or very close to a national park. And I'm particularly today going to focus on the memories of people whose houses survived the fire. Many homes were destroyed in the Kangaroo Valley fires, and thousands of homes, as Peg's already talked about, were destroyed across large areas of Australia through that national disaster, which somehow seems so long ago now. Commonly reported among people whose houses survive a disaster is a feeling of survivor guilt and a reluctance to publicly mourn because of the feeling that others have lost so much more than they have. And I want to suggest the idea that because of the entwining of the environment and home, it's possible for a house to survive, but a sense of home to be lost, or at least to become newly precarious. And I think this raises questions about home in an era increasingly defined by precarity. So in the interviews, I've been asking people what drew them to live in Kangaroo Valley in the first place. And unsurprisingly, the natural environment is at the heart of most people's decisions to live in what is just an incredibly beautiful place. And one interviewee, Sean, I'm using pseudonyms here, told me, quote, "The reason why I'm in the particular part of the world is because I just love the environment. I bought that block because of the environment, because of the surrounding forest and the animals and that sort of thing," end quote. So Sean's house did survive the fires, but the destruction of the surrounding environment was and continues to be deeply painful to him. And Sean was moved to tears by his memory of driving back into the valley on the day after the fires. And he told me, as we got closer to the property, everything was black, and that was like being on a different planet. It didn't look like the same landscape. All the vegetation's gone, so all the slopes and the gullies and the ridges, you can see them for the very first time, and it doesn't even look like your property or your land or your environment. And Sean found it difficult to negotiate emotions around the survival of his house, which he had spent many years building himself, and the scarring impacts on the landscape. How do you celebrate the survival of one when you're so devastated by damage to the other? And these emotions became more complex knowing that his neighbours had lost houses and belongings. And to quote from Sean again, "It was very strange, but the fact that the house survived was this weird thing of just being ecstatic, but really sad at the same time. Driving in the front gate, the first thing you see is wreckage everywhere. There wasn't one bit of green on the whole property. No green leaves, no grass, nothing. Every single leaf. Most of the trees, the vast majority of trees had no leaves. They were just totally black. No sticks, no nothing, just all ash. Ash all the way up to the house. Totally black all around the house, but the house survived. So that's the thing. We're probably quite different to a lot of people because a lot of people lost their house, whole house and everything. There's no right part of that at all. Some people lost fences and maybe a shed or something, but for us, we lost a building with important things in it, and yet the house survived. So there's this dual thing going on at the same time, end quote. The house of another interviewee, Mary, also survived, but she told me she would happily have swapped the house in return for the trees, birds, and other animals that were now gone. And she stated, quote, "We could rebuild our house, but this incredible, biodiverse, natural, never-touched landscape is destroyed. Like, what's the fucking house? Give me the land back." Driving back towards their home on the day after the fire, Mary and her husband became disoriented. The area had changed so much that they no longer held memories of its former self. And Mary said, quote, "We couldn't even recognize how to find our property," end quote. And it wasn't just the sight, but the sounds and the smells of the area that had been transformed. There was no bird song. There was no rustling of wind through leaves. Mary remembered that the most common sound for several days was of trees that had still been burning, finally collapsing. So geographers Alison Blunt and Robin Dowling describe home as a kind of process, including small daily routines through which we constantly make home. And when I asked another interviewee, Sally, about how life had changed since the fire, she replied by describing both her changed daily interactions with the local environment and the loss of structures on her property in ways which saw very little difference between the two. And she said, quote, "Well, the wombats have gone. I don't know where they went. My favorite wombat, who has always been here and was here just after the fire, he's gone, and I don't know where he went. Birds, significant absence of bird life. I can't get up on the ridge because it's been burnt so much that there's all this crappy slime all over the rocks, and the trees that we used to use as handholds have disappeared. What's changed? They took away the shed yesterday. They've demolished the shed, so we're getting a new shed. Look, it's hard to say, apart from the feeling that the environment is very different. If I cycle up the road, which I did yesterday, and into the national park, I'm just in this kind of war zone now." So I've become deeply interested in how people recover after the trauma of a fire or flood, and how they deal not only with the often traumatic memories of surviving the disaster, but also the loss of the material forms of memory with which we all fill our homes. And as historians, I think it's important to understand bushfire recovery, not just the fire itself, but the long afterlife of the disaster in people's lives, as having a history. And Peg's work here has been important in that respect. So in thinking through the question of what have you learned about the environment by doing oral history, what I keep coming back to is that people's recovery from fire takes place in transformed and injured environments. And those environments are not easily separable from the material structures and the belongings that are also vulnerable to the flames and which we generally think of as home. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
So we're moving now from New South Wales, where Scott and Lorina have both been working, to Victoria and Queensland. And I'm delighted to welcome and introduce, in a way, the host of the next session, Katie Holmes, my friend and colleague for more than 40 years now. Katie is director of the Centre for the Study of the Inland at La Trobe University, and has been doing oral, gender and environmental history for lots of years, with recent books including Telling Environmental Histories, Intersections of Memory, Narrative and Environment in 2017, co-edited with Goodall, and a more recent book from 2020, Mallee Country, Land, People and History, co-authored with Richard Broome, Charles Fahey and Andrea Gaynor. And I think Andrea Gaynor is here with us from Perth. So over to you, Katie, to introduce this 20-minute format, slightly different format, and to introduce your co-interviewees.
Thanks, Al. So yes, I'm delighted to host this session, and can you all hear me?
Yes, all good.
Yep, great, okay. And just like to begin by acknowledging that both Deb and Karen and I, all three of us, are standing, living, working on Wurundjeri country, and acknowledge the legacies that we have from Aboriginal land use and understandings. To begin, I'm going to make the introductions really quick because we've got such a little time to talk about this wonderful topic. Deb Anderson is a lecturer in journalism at Monash, and she's the author of Endurance, Australian Stories of Drought, published in 2014. And she's now working on stories of crisis, loss and renewal in Queensland communities that have been affected by cyclones. So Deb brings this wonderful journalism and oral history background together. Karen Twigg has recently completed a wonderful thesis called Along Tyrrell Creek, an environmental history of a Mallee community, which has been awarded the Nancy Millis Prize at La Trobe University for one of the top 5% theses in the university. And Karen is also a public historian. So I'd like to begin by asking them both, if you like, the key question that this particular panel is addressing, which is about what have we learnt about oral history and our environment. So in a sense, the question I'd frame to both Karen and to Deb is, how has doing oral history changed the ways in which you've seen the environments that you work in?
I would like Karen to go first, as she's just finished her PhD, and I would love her to take this opportunity. So you go first, Karen.
Yeah, thank you, Katie, and thank you, Alf, and all the organisers. It's been a fabulous morning and a really friendly gathering too. Yes, as the environment I've been researching is the wheat farming locality of Berrywillick. It's part of, as many of you all know, it's part of the Mallee, which is in the northwest corner of Victoria. And my the background to my image is designed to trick you. I'm actually sitting in Brunswick at the moment, but I wanted to use this image just to give you a sense, perhaps, of my first impressions of this landscape. It's a photo I took in 2014 on my first field trip to the Mallee, and at that time I saw it as an incredibly monotonous, dull, flat, dry landscape with almost nothing to distinguish one locality from the other. It also appeared to me a landscape pretty much overrun with the demands of industrial agriculture. There was these endless broadacre paddocks stretching to the horizon. There was these giant, quite intimidating farm machines, and a sort of a sense of a place emptying itself of people. So oral history for me really did profoundly alter that view. It, you know, I think fundamentally by bringing the environmental change down to the local level, to the micro level, and allowing me to see it through my interviewee's eyes. You know, I did some interviews in farmhouses. I also conducted many walking across paddocks, like the one you see behind me, and driving across paddocks. And so those interviews really did help me understand just how multi-layered the farm environment is. It is a site of industrial agriculture, but it is also very much simultaneously a home, a place of identity, an archive of family memory. You know, that dam over there that was built by grandfather was also points to the importance of water in a very dry landscape, and prompts memories of, you know, more intimate memories of yabbying, learning to swim there, and also stories that are changing at the moment as the Mallee Wimmera pipeline comes through, and those dams are often filled in. So I guess just to finish there and say that certainly for me, oral history has transformed my view of this environment to this sort of multi-layered, multifaceted place that it's sort of a bit strange now to think that I once saw it as sort of homogenous and dull.
Thanks, Karen. So it's a really interesting way in which you've, it's complicated so much the landscape for you or the environment for you. That's great. Deb, how about you?
Thanks, Katie. And thanks, Karen. I kind of come from the inside of that, I guess, in how I've approached the value and application and power of oral history in the work that I do. So I grew up in North Queensland on a little dairy farm, which sits on the edge of what became World Heritage Rainforest during my upbringing, just inland from Cairns. And so I come from a long line of farmers who can talk you under the table. And in going to university, going from a rural place to an urban place to Brisbane to go to uni, I soon understood, maybe was not able to articulate it very well, and I still struggle to articulate it, but I soon understood that there was something different going on in the way that, the orality of the way that stories are told and transmitted, and understandings of place were valued where I came from, which you'd think is not all that dissimilar to kind of urban context, but I guess I had that appreciation of the way that oral stories kind of contain bearers of cultural meaning. And that's different to the more segmentary traits of writing, I think. And I was always fascinated by that. It's one of the reasons why I went on to become a journalist and I thought of myself not as a writer, but as an interviewer. So I brought that even, when I became a researcher and joined Monash University. It's the interviewing, the speaking to people, the listening, the telling of story has always been at the heart of what I do. And I think that like oral stories are still different, even in a society where literacy or even self-consciousness kind of permeate our culture. Like even where we're quite, conscious of the way that we say things, I still think that there's something really valuable in orality. So I don't think it's not something that I feel that I've brought in. I feel like I've started there and then I've sought to bring in other ways of thinking about the meaning of those stories. So therefore, perhaps looking to environmental history and to cultural history for the value that they would bring. Yeah.
Thanks, Deb. That's a wonderful kind of contrast in a sense to Karen's, because what you've highlighted there is the voice, the significance of the story, and Karen's sort of attention to the way in which she's seeing the landscape differently. In some ways, it strikes me that that's getting at some of the differences between oral history and environmental history. I've often thought that they have quite different epistemological traditions, so that environmental history comes more from a kind of ecological epistemology and with its roots in the environmental movement. Oral history is much more aligned to social history, which privileges the human story. So you've got on the one hand the environmental history where the agency of the environment is privileged, oral history which privileges the human. I'd like to ask you both to reflect on that and the ways in which each of those different strands changes the way in which you might think about the other. So how does environmental history change oral history and vice versa? Deb, do you want to start there?
I'll try. That's a really good question, a really complex question. I agree. I mean, I think that I have looked to environmental history for its ways of thinking and writing about the environmental, the agency of the environment. And in the two main research projects I've done a little bit on bushfire, but they've mostly been on drought in the Mallee and perceptions of climate change during the millennium drought. And now with cyclones up north and perceptions of climate change in the context of 3 Category 5 cyclones up north. In both of those contexts, I can hear the agency of the environment coming through in the stories that people tell me, no matter where they're at on the spectrum of their thinking on climate science and of the impact of climate change on the environment in which they live, you know, whether they sort of take a really conservative business as usual approach of, you know, this, we've seen change before and this is all happening again, or whether they are, you know, involved in environmental conservation efforts and, you know, absolutely able to articulate how the changes that they see and how they connect that with that sort of climate science and that sort of notion of outside expertise that they use to make sense of where they live. So when I've captured those kinds of stories, I find myself looking to environmental history scholarship for ways of describing and explaining, interpreting, representing that material in my own scholarship or writing. And meanwhile, you know, in terms of oral history, like, you know, my library of oral history is all new voices at the intersection of oral and environmental history, you know, is one that I've kind of been going through at the moment. I mean, all of the stuff that I read tends to be, in terms of oral history, is about the environment, which I agree with you, sort of privileges the social and the cultural still to a large degree, although increasingly, you know, they're learning from each other in really productive ways. Don't know if I've answered your question there, but I do think that there is something happening there where they're learning from each other now, which has been in part inspired by the projects that you're doing, Katie. So, yeah.
Not sure about that, Deb. Karen, would you like to have a stab at that? I know this is something you've also thought quite deeply about.
Yes, I think yes, I've thought a lot about, you know, what environmental history brings to oral history, what oral history brings to environmental history. You know, I think in summary, it is that dynamic agency of the environment that oral history, that environmental history brings. And I guess my sense is that oral history brings to environmental history more that that complexity and that ability to move to the micro level. I guess because I did come to environmental history, I came to environmental history as an oral historian. It really strikes me how much this emphasis on the dynamic and active agency of the environment can really change and create. I think as an oral historian, it's given me a much broader repertoire, I guess, when I approach an oral history interview. So, you know, I think as oral historians, often we do look at place, we look at attachment, we look at meaning in place, but often with the environment reduced to a sort of a fairly passive or static backdrop. And for me, you know, grappling with this idea of plants, animals, soil, climate, weather, interacting with human lives and changing human lives, you can really transform the way we think about a person's life. And there was one point in my research over the last few years that was really came home to me, and that was when I interviewed a farmer who'd recently retired from a very Willock farm to a regional town, and she lived there for 50 years. When she left the farm, she left it in the care of her son and his family. But in our interview, she talked about feeling like a quote, caged lion in this home that she'd moved to. She talked about leaving the farm, the front door open, even though it faced onto a busy street, just to help reduce this sense that she was cooped in. And I think at the time I didn't really think very much of that comment until the next day when she and her husband took me on a tour of their former farm. And on that tour, which was supposed to last just a few hours and ended up lasting the whole day, it really brought home to me the fact that as we went through each paddock and Bev explained to me her work routines and the impact of the drought of the 60s and the drought of the 80s on her and her husband and their work routines that had helped them try and survive on the land and to hand over a viable enterprise to their son. And for me, it really highlighted that fact that it enlarged my view of Bev's life by seeing her in the context of her farm and how much she'd been moulded by by this place, and the very hard sacrificial work that she'd undertaken there. But also, I guess that the other side of just how profoundly Bev herself had shaped this farm, both with her action and with her attitudes. And to me, it's one of those really profound insights that environmental history offers, that there is a relationship between the way places look and the stories that are told of them. And Bev certainly in our interview shared many stories that spoke of this narrative of hard work and the importance of human persistence. And walking around the farm, you could see that reflected in the environment, in the piles of stones and mallee roots that were piled at the side of the paddocks, in the old pig shed that Bev showed me, which really she had started that enterprise as a way of giving the farm another income stream during the drought and trying to help it survive. So I guess really it feels to me like this focus on the dynamic agency of the environment just provides this whole other way of understanding our interviewees. And yeah. I guess it's more I could say there about environmental history. But
thanks, Karen. That's such a lovely example to illustrate the point you're making. And listening to you, it strikes me that it's not just an issue around how one shapes the other, like how we can see the impact of the environment on the person and vice versa. It's perhaps also about the way in which the nature of the environment actually shapes how stories are told, not just which stories are told, but how the very ways in which they're articulated and structured, and which gets back to the place that Deb started at, and perhaps picking up some of Scott's comments about disasters. We've all worked in the Mallee, where of course drought is a dominant feature, and it's not the disaster narrative of the dramatic story, it's the slow violence that the stories that we hear often. Deb, just throwing to you there, having worked in the kind of cyclone disaster where it's a sudden onset and the Mallee, could you just reflect, perhaps to finish us off, a little bit about the different ways in which stories in those places are articulated and shaped by the varying environments that they come from?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. I mean, I do again need to sort of preface anything I say about North Queensland with the fact that I grew up there, and I have, I grew up on a farm there, and so therefore I feel that there are kind of bearers of cultural meaning that I'm not even aware that, because I grew up with them, right? So I took them as default. That was the way we understood the world. Although doing oral history in the place returning to that place now, kind of recycling my past for the purpose of research in some ways, makes me I'm confronted with some of those assumptions all the time. I think there is a tropics of the imagination that certainly is present in the way that people tell stories about Cyclone Up North. And I think that comes back. I mean, there's things that Scott said, you know, I was kind of writing down constantly in terms of identity and memory that are really significant in the way that people tell that the story of that tropical place. And much like I'm sure you found, Karen, and you too, Katie, in the Mallee, where drought is not so much a disaster in that sort of, you know, sudden impact way. There's an internalizing of cyclone as part of identity too up north. You know, we're bred tough north of the border, which is, you know, really anywhere north of Mackay, like, you know, it's really north. And so there's a way of internalizing that means it's something that we live with over time. Cyclone is something that's lived with as opposed, and the risk and the threat is something that's lived with as much as the event and the loss. But I think that something Karen said then also prompted me to think about the way that doing oral history enables you to capture something of how the event impacted a person back then, but also how the recollection of that, telling the memory of that affects them now. And that's also really valuable if you're thinking about how climate change over time might change the way people tell that story of place. And the significance or the way they think about farming, or the way they think about the future of industrial farming in particular. I don't know. Yeah.
Well, and indeed how the way the changing place changes the story and changes the memory.
Yes.
I would love to continue this interview for a long time, unlike an oral history interview where you can kind of talk over a cup of tea, etc. Now, I'm sorry, but I'm getting the wind up and we have to finish. And it's been wonderful to talk to you both. Thank you very much for the thoughtfulness and insightfulness of your responses.
Oh, thanks, Karen and Katie.
Thank you all. Yes, indeed, wonderful to conduct an interview on Zoom with a public audience. Short and sweet, would have been lovely to hear more, but it does remind us of the value of dialogue and how much more you can learn when one person talks to another, as opposed to just talking by yourself. And what we're going to do now is we've got 25 minutes for a Q&A session. I'm just going to share my screen for one moment, just to show you roughly how we're going to structure this. I'll just move that to the side. So basically, we thought we'd just have the first 10 minutes or so focusing on questions that are about oral history, and then the last 10 minutes or so focusing on questions that are about environmental history. But absolutely happy if those questions blur across or show the connections between the two. I'm going to facilitate the session, but Nicolette and Claudia are going to ask the questions. And I think Claudia is going to start off first with the questions to do with oral history. So Claudia, over to you.
Thanks, Al. I think we're still waiting for some questions to come through, but the ones that have come so far, I think probably questions for Lorina. And even earlier in the conversation today, there were comments coming through on the chat line alluding to the relationship between settler Australians, Indigenous Australians and the environment. So just reading out a couple of those for context. From Katie Holmes, I'm wondering if the devil in Peg's discussion is not climate change but settler Australians. And from Deb Anderson, is the devil coming over the mountain the mirror? So yeah, just with that background, we'll dive into the questions that have come now through. So the first one is, do our history schools need to include in the curriculum specific training for non-Indigenous white researchers about oral history interviews with Indigenous people?
And I think that one's for you to start with, Lorina.
Yes, I think we should. I think these are things that I've been also working on in my development and my own methodologies, and we're lucky enough to have our Al at Monash. We have an oral history unit of study, and I think one of the questions that somebody also asked in the chat line is, how do we work with non-Indigenous people on research projects and in Aboriginal-led projects? And I think it always comes back to, people's ability to recognise their own positioning and and what they need to do, the work that they need to do in order to be able to work with communities, and to be able to, and be prepared to decolonise themselves, recognise that they have to do that, and go through the process. And that's a journey that everyone would have to take themselves. Aboriginal people can't kind of tell you how to do it. We can help you on the journey and advise you. But I think a lot of the work has to be done by every individual. And as I said, I've gone through a process with my own education experience, is to decolonise myself. And as I was saying in the chat room, I had to also recognise that I was taught in the Western system. And so when I went out and was doing my PhD research, I also started doing things really, really formal, oral history way of doing things, which wasn't necessarily the way in which my communities wanted me to do those oral histories. And I kind of learned that quite early on, what not to do in my communities. And so then I went through this whole process of recognising. And the journey has taken me here, and now I apply that sort of stuff and applying it into my Songlines of Country project, and all the projects I've worked on over the last couple of years is actually going with the flow with what the community wants. And how they want to structure those interviews. So you might think you want to do a one-on-one interview, which we as oral historians learn how to do the best approach to a one-on-one oral history, the nice clean audio recording for archival purposes, which we all hope to achieve. But that's not necessarily the case when you're working with Aboriginal communities, and you've got to be able to adapt to that and be flexible, because communities will also dictate who they want in the room, how they want that session recorded. And if you go setting up an interview, it also changes the dynamic of the stories that you might also get. So it stunts people. So it changes the way they might, the stories that they tell, because you're making them uncomfortable with all the technology, micing people up. You got the camera too close. They're just looking straight at the camera instead of looking at each other. So all those things about setting up dynamics in community. So it also changes the way in which the conversation between you and all the participants. And I'm kind of also starting to do that, where I use film so I can actually see it, and analyse and see what I still need to learn and I need to slap myself on the wrist and stop doing.
Thanks, Lorina. That's great. Claudia, other questions about oral history?
Okay, there's one related one for Lorina, which actually came from myself. You've partly answered it. I wonder what your experience is of Indigenous and settler Australians working together on OH projects involving Aboriginal communities, and whether you feel such collaborations are counter to principles of agency and self-determination.
Yeah, that's a pretty tough one. And I think, as you do projects, all my projects have been working with, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal researchers and Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal artists. So in all the projects I've worked in, there has been, you know, depending on whether it's oral history or if it's film. So people go in with their preconceived ways of doing things and their practice. So if they're filmmakers usually want to set it up, and they've got their style of doing interviews as well. So I've had to, along the way, explain to the people I engage with the film to film the recording, do the recordings for me, and to say, look, you know, the camera's too close. Auntie's not very comfortable, and sometimes the aunties or the uncles will actually slap the person over the wrist and say, you know, stop bossing me around and telling me that you got to move this way and that way. So while that's normal for filmmakers to say, to control the lens and how they view it, what they can see through the lens, that doesn't translate when you're actually trying to giving directions to community members, because most of the time, sometimes they think you're growling or rousing on them, and they get upset and they don't like being told what to do by younger people. So,
Lorina. Claudia, other questions?
There's a question that came in about working on soundscapes alongside oral history. That is, recordings that might reveal change, for example, pre and post a natural event.
Thanks, Claudia. Maybe I can...
The question actually says, who is working on soundscapes along with oral history? Yeah.
Right. So can I direct that to other members of the panel who's been working on soundscapes alongside interviewing? Anyone?
I haven't done that yet, but it's the next thing that I'm really keen to do. I've started a project on stories of women's environmental leadership over the past 60 years with respect to the Great Barrier Reef. And so we're working with a sound artist at Griffith University who can, yes, absolutely, like alongside the oral histories we're doing, who can think about the significance of audio and of sound and of soundscapes in telling the story of these women's connections to the reef and their quest to champion the value of the reef to other people. Yes.
Anyone else been doing, Katie?
I was just going to say, in the book Telling Environmental Histories, the edited collection that Al mentioned, there's a chapter by Leona Skelton, and she's looking at the River Tyne and it's got some wonderful discussions in there about the soundscape and the ways in which her interviewees reflect on it and talk about the things that they started to hear when the river became cleaned up, but also the things that they missed once the river had become cleaned up. So there's some lovely discussion there.
Thanks. Anybody else want to comment about soundscapes? Peg, you look like you're ready to speak. Go for it. You have to unmute, Peg.
There we go. I suppose you could say I did a few unintentional soundscapes, because I'm sure that, you know, we've all been in the place where you're doing a recording and something intrudes. And for me, it was always the environment. So whether it was, you know, standing on the shoulders of Mount Sugarloaf and doing an outside interview with Ian McKinnon, and we couldn't record because the wind was so loud, because the trees were gone. You know, there was no break. And another time when we were down at the Poetry Tree and we couldn't record because 18 months after the fires, there were still 10-ton trucks coming across the bridge clearing houses and house sites, and, you know, talking about drought, and all of a sudden you get this thunderstorm on top of a tin roof. And I mean, I've been thinking all along that in conventional oral history, these might be considered flawed interviews because it's really hard to put them together and to use them. for any type of broadcast, but it did bring the environment into the discussion, and we were talking about as an agent. And to me, it really brought home the challenges that people were facing in their day-to-day life in a way that words could not have.
Thanks, Peg. I love that notion of the environment as an agent in the oral.
Oh, yeah. Listen to me.
That's a nice place to segue. Nicolette's been gathering questions related to environmental history. Nicolette, over to you.
Thank you. This question came up after the discussion and interview that Katie did with Karen and Deb. And the question is about, do settler Australian researchers and narrators assume that as humans we can control natural phenomena and the natural environment? And therefore, do natural disasters disrupt that assumption?
Yes.
Katie, do you want to start with that? Or?
Okay. I think that has been an assumption that what those of us who work in environmental history would suggest has been continuously disproven, that the Australian environment in particular has done its level best to teach us otherwise, and that settler Australians have been extremely slow to learn those lessons, and we've just seen that repeatedly, I think, and climate change is exacerbating that experience. But and I think part of that is to do with the fact that European settlers came from a much more benign environment, and that didn't tend to kind of, as one person put it to me, turn on you in the way that the Australian environment can, which in itself is really interesting, the way in which the environment is positioned as this aggressor. So I think that settlers have taken a long time to understand that, and it's still inherent in a lot of our thinking and a lot of our environmental policies and approaches, this desire to control, and it's a pretty self-defeating approach. And interestingly, when you work in places like the Mallee, it's one of those things that people in the Mallee, after generations of living there, will start to acknowledge that, you know, actually there's a kind of reconciliation at some point with this landscape, that they've got to that point of not just trying constantly to subdue it.
Great, thank you.
Nicolette, do you want to ask another one?
Yeah, I've got two left here on the list. This one is about perhaps about how people feel about the land or their identity in relation to land and country. As in relation to parts of Victoria which corporations are buying up larger farms, how does that impact the way people or farmers feel about the land and therefore their identity?
Karen, do you want to start with that one? Karen? You want to come in on that one, Karen?
I'm very sorry, Al, but my internet's breaking up at the moment, so I didn't quite hear that question.
The question was, with large
Can you
corporations...
hear me?
Can you hear me? The question that large corporations increasingly breaking up smaller farms, for example, across Victoria, what sort of impact is that going to have? I've probably missed the rest of it. Does that make sense?
It's a question about identity. It's a question about changing identity with the large-scale corporation taking over land ownership in Victoria.
Karen's breaking up. Do you want to have a go at that one, Katie?
Oh, well, I'd prefer it if Karen can.
Yes, I'm sorry, I am only getting little bits and pieces of this, but if you can hear me. Yeah, I think that this sense of you know, I gather it's to do with this idea of connection to place, and you know how that can get eroded by bigger, that being taken over by bigger enterprises. It's certainly in the little area that I've looked at, and it's something that oral history has perhaps highlighted, is the real struggle that farmers face, and you could almost call it trauma, in trying to reconcile the demands to, you know, to keep getting bigger and bigger in order to survive in this environment, with the knowledge that by getting bigger and bigger, that's actually eroding community and eroding a sense of place and a sense of connection. Perhaps that's stepping away a bit from, perhaps the question was about corporations, but I do think that my interviews highlighted how that struggle was, that struggle to reconcile competing demands to survive in this environment, as well as to continue to have a community, to have something that nourished family, nourished the children staying on the farms, was a constant tension, and something that, you know, was that came out all the time in my interviews.
Thanks, Karen. I wonder, Scott, does that question resonate with you in terms of the communities where you've interviewed which have been profoundly damaged and affected? Does that make, you know, do you want to respond to that one as well?
Yeah, I guess the Kangaroo Valley community is, yeah, it's not, you know, defined by sort of, it's not agricultural in the same sense that Karen's talking about. I guess one of the things that's relevant in terms of identity and an attachment to the land and community is that a sense of community and participation in community has been really valuable to people in Kangaroo Valley after the fires. And when I talk about, you know, a sense of you're present, you're being at home in these places, being troubled and becoming kind of precarious, one of the ways that people are working through that is by connecting to community members and being part of conversations. And something that's really troubled that, of course, is coronavirus and the inability to actually have those connections to community and to kind of share an attachment to place with your community. Because, you know, one person talked to me about, you know, all I want is a hug at the moment. I want to hug people. People talked about, well, we were going to have a great community event to talk about how we're all doing, and we can't do that anymore. That just has to wait. So I guess, yeah, in terms of that relationship to place, that's really relevant.
Thanks, Scott. Nicolette, other questions?
Yeah, the last one that I've got here, it was directed for Scott, but I think it could be more broadly answered by anyone. And it's got to do with the narrator's subject position. So for a natural disaster, is there a difference in response to the fire amongst those who are long-time residents of an area compared with those who might be tree changers? And that's why I think this could be asked more broadly than just about fire. Does your position as someone who's lived there for a long time or someone who's a little bit newer, do their narratives or their identity to their place change when in their interviews?
Scott, do you want to start with that? And then I'm sure Peg will have something to say, and maybe others as well.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And I guess I'm trying to think through the interviews. I guess a couple of the interviews I did with more long-term people, one of their reactions was surprised that this fire didn't act like they thought fire should act, and what their kind of history of attachment to that place and their relationship to fire, which is, you know, a long-term relationship for a lot of people, including a couple of people who stayed and defended their property and happily survived, but had a very, very scary experience, and who were confronted as the fire arrived with this, well, this isn't what we thought fire was, and this isn't what we thought we were going to go through. So I guess there's that difference, that maybe people who are kind of longer term residents in a community are facing something that's quite different from what they understood in the past.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Peg, do you want to continue that?
Yeah, well, actually, it is a good question. We were discussing it at one point in the breakout rooms about exactly that difference. And I wouldn't be able to make a firm statement that said tree changers had less of a commitment and therefore were less inclined to rebuild or to stay in the area. But what I did notice was that people who had an inherited set of stories about previous fires seemed to be much more accepting of the extremity of Black Saturday. So I said in the breakout room, one of my narrators said, my father saw the mountain burn 3 times, and having those transmitted memories seem to help people put things into perspective and perhaps assist them with the decisions after the fire. And sometimes those decisions were to leave rather than to stay, but it seemed to be drawing from a broader knowledge base, which I think, to me is a tiny, tiny fraction of what Lorina's been talking about.
Yeah.
Katie, were you trying to come in there?
Oh, actually, I was trying to come in on the previous discussion about that Karen was talking about in relation to the sort of companies buying up land and moving into communities, and the discussion about identity and community is really strong. But one of the other concerns that many people have is that corporations don't have the same connection to the land and the country that people who have lived and farmed in those areas for some time, let alone, of course, Indigenous populations have, and that they are often the absent landlords, or they have a manager there who, might be fairly transitory, and that actually means that the country is not well cared for. And this is something that I know has been a really big issue, particularly in parts of Australia, of trying to get Indigenous people onto country to care for country. It's also something that even in farming communities, people are saying, well, we need people living on these lands, living in the landscape in order to care for it properly.
Thanks, Katie. Look, we're going to round it up here. We did agree when we set up the symposium not to make it too long, because we know that Zoom can be even more exhausting than meeting face-to-face. Just a few closing remarks and reminders before I do a couple of thank yous. Firstly, just to all of those who are in Victoria, just a reminder that the Community History Awards this year include an Oral History Award that's jointly awarded by the Community History Awards, the Public Record Office, Royal Historical Society and Oral History Victoria. And the deadline is 8th of July. So if you've been doing an oral history project and would like to get recognised, please have a look at the details. They're on the Oral History Victoria website. Also, to those of you who, actually this is those in Victoria, but it could apply to anyone in Australia. If you're not already a member of one of the State Oral History Association, please do join. In Victoria, the last Tuesday of every month, we're having an online drop-in discussion about anybody's oral history's issues and concerns. Details of that are also on the Oral History Victoria website. And the third little reminder, Judy's going to be sending out a feedback form after this session. We'd love to get your feedback. It's the first time we've done anything like this. We'll probably do it again, not least because I'm seeing in the chats that colleagues from regional Victoria find it much more easy to be included when we do this than running things in Melbourne. So there's a lesson to be learned there. So please do respond with your feedback. It'd be really useful. And just before I do the thank yous, now that we know that the system hasn't crashed, maybe if everyone can put their videos back on so we can see everybody who's in the room at the very end. So I can also at the same time just thank everybody. Particularly thank you to the 6 presenters, Deb and Peg, Scott, Katie, Karen and Lorina. Fantastic set of experiences and expertise from different parts of the country, from different contexts. Really stimulating, really exciting. And I'm going to look forward to actually listening to the video because I was so busy doing techie stuff, I missed half of what you said. So thank you all. Thank you also to my co-hosts from Oral History Victoria, Claudia, Nicolette, Naomi and Judy. Thanks so much for technically making this possible and helping all the people who are having techie issues. And lastly, thank all of you for turning up, giving up your Sunday morning, wherever you are, in Kentucky, South Korea, most states of Australia. Really, really pleased to welcome you, if you like, to Melbourne and to Victoria for this event. And we look forward to doing this again now that we've shown that it's possible. So maybe our colleagues in Queensland or WA will host an equivalent event and we can join you from our bits of the country or from overseas. So that's it from us. Have a lovely Sunday afternoon or Saturday night if you're in Kentucky. And we look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks, everybody. Okay, then.